As you all just heard in our 2023 year in review, Sisters Hope Foundation was fortunate enough to lead a patient-led listening session for the FDA on January 17th, 2024. What many probably don't know is that our original 90-minute presentation was reduced to 60 minutes due to the internal workings of the FDA. We are thankful for the 60 minutes we were able to speak with the FDA. All the presenters agree it was a valuable and positive experience. We shared the ALSP community voice clearly, passionately, and poignantly. The FDA was well represented and very engaged during the question and answer portion following our presentation. We had representatives from all three centers at the FDA as well as from the Office of the Commissioners. Today, we would like to share with you our complete presentation that would have been given at the 90-minute session. To the patients and care partners, we hope that you feel well represented, heard, and understood. We hope you are encouraged by the fact that you are not alone in this disease and know you have many working diligently on your behalf to raise awareness and fight for a cure. To the clinicians, we hope that this presentation gives you a clear picture and broader understanding of what patients and families living with ALSP experience each day. Thank you for listening. Let's get started.
Adult onset leukoencephalopathy with axonal spheroids and pigmented glia, also known as ALSP, is the disease that brings us before you today. Why is it important for you to hear the ALSP patient voice? What makes us stand out? Every person, every family is touched by disease and death, it's true. But here are the cold hard facts that make ALSP so horrific and devastating. It is a rapidly progressing, debilitating disease that hits the young in the prime of life, between 30 to 50 years of age, leaving in its wake a life cut short, financial ruin, and shattered families. And it doesn't just happen once in a family. It happens over and over and over because it is an autosomal dominant hereditary disease. Every child of an affected parent has a 50-50 chance of inheriting the genetic mutation responsible for causing ALSP. Families live through the nightmare time and time again, generation after generation. To highlight the difficulties, Dr. Jennifer Orthman-Murphy will provide a brief overview of ALSP, highlighting the challenges in diagnosing and the clinical severity of the disease.
Autosomal dominant pathogenic variants cause ALSP, or adult onset leukoencephalopathy with axonal spheroids and pigmented glia. And this was diagnosed at autopsy. It was essentially, all of the terms that were used to describe this were a collection of words that describe the findings that were in brain lesions, including loss of myelin, axonal spheroids, abnormal looking macrophages or reduced macrophages, bizarre looking astrocytes, and abnormal looking neurons. And it wasn't until around 2011, 2012 where it was discovered that variants in the gene cause this, leading to different versions of this name that you can diagnose with genetic testing. So one of the challenges with ALSP is that there's a highly variable presentation. Individuals typically present in the 4th or 5th decade of life. The symptoms vary. They can involve behavioral changes, cognitive impairment, progressive motor impairment, and the type of progressive motor impairment can confuse who's presenting and which doctor is taking care of them about what kind of disease they're seeing. So it can look like Parkinson's disease, it can look like multiple sclerosis. Women can sometimes present earlier with the motor symptoms. But also you have other neurological signs and symptoms like cerebellar ataxia or seizures. And this can vary even between family members. And so because of all of these, as well as the brain MRI findings that can also be confused with other disorders, including strokes, there's a high likelihood of misdiagnosis. And this is an incredible challenge because it can be rapidly progressive over the course of 2 to 3 years. So you don't have time to go on a diagnostic odyssey. Shown here are some examples of what the brain can look like much later in the course of disease, where you have diffuse involvement of the white matter. You can have atrophy of the brain. There's areas of the corpus callosum that are thin. Those are the areas that connect the parts of the brain. You have areas, as shown in E, that look like strokes, and that can be misdiagnosed. And you can also, on head CT, have areas of calcification, even these typical stepping stone calcifications. But actually, if you look in the left corner, sometimes the MRI looks just like MS. And so people will think that that's the initial diagnosis and even treat for it. And so it's incredibly important that we understand what causes this disease, and it's the gene variants in this gene that encode this colony-stimulating factor receptor type 1 that's expressed on the cell surface of monocytes. And the signaling from this receptor that responds to particular ligands is required for the survival and proliferation of monocytes. Monocytes are the type of immune cell that circulate throughout the body, and when they go into tissues, they become macrophages, and microglia are these are derived from monocytes and are the resident innate immune cells of the central nervous system. The majority of the pathogenic variants are in this intracellular tyrosine kinase domain, which we think is at least affecting its intracellular signaling. And because of this discovery of CSF1R, this became the first known microgliopathy, because it was the first known genetic disorder to affect microglia in particular. And what's key, and what you're going to hear about today in much more detail, is that treatment is inadequate. There are no disease-modifying treatments. Hematopoietic stem cell transplant has been performed in a few patients, with this trend towards stabilization of disease in the people that have survived and the citations of the multiple reports that have happened. And there's also a phase 2 clinical trial ongoing, oh, that's louder, that you've all heard about already. But the current standard of care is limited to symptomatic and supportive treatment. And so we have the Medical and Scientific Advisory Council for the Sisters Hope Foundation, where we're discussing diagnostic criteria, the different versions of the name, and clinical management consensus guidelines, so we can help people that are getting diagnosed, both the families, the people getting diagnosed, and the providers that are taking care of them, to know what to do. We also have a work group for ALSP that was established through the Global Leukodystrophy Initiative to get people with ALSP ready for clinical trial for disease-modifying therapy. And there's multiple natural history study efforts currently ongoing. Thank you.
You didn't think twice this morning about waking up, taking a shower, getting dressed, brushing your teeth, eating your breakfast, and leaving for this conference or for work. It was routine. ALSP robs patients of their independence quickly and completely. These simple, everyday tasks are impossible to complete without help for the person affected by ALSP. This loss of independence is taxing on the patient, their caregiver, and their whole family. The caregiver finds themselves in a never-ending cycle, waking early to get themselves ready, caring for their loved one by cleaning soiled clothing and bedding, transferring into a wheelchair, administering a shower, and dressing in fresh clothes. And that's all before breakfast. After preparing breakfast, the caregiver must feed their loved one because their loved one cannot control their hands and arms. Then the caregiver rushes off to work. Nearly 75% of caregivers work full-time. Most of the money earned goes right back into the care of the loved one. Remember, this disease strikes in the prime of life. Wealth has not been accrued, and most patients are too young to qualify for government programs intended for the elderly. Two-income families suddenly find themselves reduced to one income, with the added burden of the high cost of caring for a disabled adult. While the primary caregiver is at work, the ALSP patient is either dropped off at an adult daycare, looked after by in-home care, or left alone. Many ALSP patients have trouble speaking, so it's difficult to know what they need, but they are 100% dependent on the caregiver. To eat, to use the bathroom, or be changed, to take medication, to exercise, everything. When the caregiver finally arrives home from work, more work awaits. Cooking dinner, feeding loved one, cleaning house, washing laundry, getting loved one ready for bed, brushing their teeth, changing clothes, transferring to bed, tucking in. The next day it happens all over again, 7 days a week, every day of the year. No break. Endless days of being wheelchair bound and 100% dependent for the ALSP patient and another day of rushing and working and worrying for the caregiver.
There is a range and variety of symptoms that ALSP patients experience. Gait, coordination and mobility problems, cognitive changes, behavioral issues, communication difficulties, urinary and fecal incontinence, seizures, skin issues, and respiratory challenges. It's a full body, whole person disease. There are multiple organ systems involved and affected. Medications and therapies are used in an attempt to manage symptoms, but universally, these medications and therapies provide little to no benefit in slowing progression or effectively managing symptoms. According to a survey of the ALSP community conducted by Sisters Hope Foundation, the top 5 most burdensome symptoms are cognitive changes, behavioral disruptions, gait and mobility problems, incontinence, and seizures. It is nearly impossible to focus on the absolute most burdensome symptom. There are multiple reasons for this. Initial symptoms of ALSP patients vary from person to person, even within members of the same family. And generally, patients exhibit multiple symptoms simultaneously as the disease takes hold and progresses. No 2 manifestations are the same. We'd like to share some personal stories describing the impact of these top 5 most burdensome symptoms. In every patient family journey, there is a pivotal moment when you know life will never be the same again. And that moment for me was when I arrived home from my grandfather's funeral. One look at my mom, and I knew she was sick. I could tell by the look in her eye, the tremor in her hand, the slouched posture, and the shuffling gait. I knew she was suffering from the same disease that took the lives of my grandma and my aunt. Grandma Loda, the matriarch of our family, was the first family member in my lifetime to develop ALSP. Her first symptoms were cognitive. 2 fairly dramatic events happened that indicated that my grandmother was ill. First, after many decades working at Bank of America, she was let go because she could no longer accomplish the calculations and manipulate the numbers necessary to do her job. She had been the financial manager of my grandparents' household. When she was let go and my grandpa was alerted that something was wrong, he checked the household finances and found them in shambles. Secondly, and even more frightening, one day while walking home from the dry cleaners, my grandma was hit by a car while she was crossing a crosswalk. Her executive functioning was so disrupted by this point that she did not use caution and verify that all vehicles had stopped to let her pass. Her pelvis was shattered, and this traumatic event sped up the progression of her disease. While laying in the hospital bed recovering from her shattered pelvis, she was no longer able to communicate. She couldn't find the words. I still remember her lying there, tears streaming down her face. We didn't know what was wrong and she couldn't tell us. My Aunt Tina was the next family member to develop symptoms. Her initial symptoms were behavioral. She was misdiagnosed with severe depression. The antidepressants she was prescribed did little to ease this symptom. As the disease progressed, it was clear this was something more than depression. Like her mom, she quickly lost her ability to communicate. My aunt was a choir director at our church, and no longer being able to sing or to give direction took the joy of directing from her. The other symptom that my aunt exhibited that was highly distressing were seizures. Data shows that about 30% of ALSP patients suffer from seizures. My aunt suffered from very long, very hard seizures that were uncontrolled with medication. One Christmas day, our family went to the nursing home where my aunt was living. We wanted to sing some Christmas carols and spend a few hours with her. When we walked into her room, she was laying in bed seizing. It's an image I'll never forget. Body stiff, rigid and shaking, labored breathing. That seizure lasted 2 hours before it stopped. My mom, Betty, first presented with motor symptoms, shaking hands, freezing feet. It looked like she had Parkinson's, but the carbidopa-levodopa did nothing to ease these life-changing symptoms. She was a talented and respected organist and pianist. She'd been playing organ for church since the age of 14. This huge piece of her life, this piece that brought her and so many others joy, was gone. Her left hand would no longer respond to the directions she gave it. She could no longer play the music that brought her peace and happiness. Betty was once an avid rower. She competed in competitions all over the U.S. After symptoms of ALSP began to present, she wanted to try kayaking. I watched as my mom struggled to hold the paddle, put the blade in the water, and pull to propel herself. It was a painful experience for both of us. She was frustrated at her lack of ability to perform this seemingly simple exercise, and I was devastated. My mom couldn't coordinate enough to use a paddle, a task that had once been second nature to her. My mom, also known as Namo to her grandchildren, was known for her energy, her willingness to get down on the floor and play with her grandkids. But as her disease progressed, this was another thing that was ripped from her. She could no longer give her grandchildren piggyback rides. She could no longer play catch. She could barely receive energetic hugs from her grandkids for fear that in their enthusiasm to show her love, they might accidentally knock her off balance, causing her to fall. In many ways, my mom's cognition was spared. Her memory remained mostly intact. However, it became very challenging for her to learn new things, and early on, she lost her ability to plan ahead and make decisions. The fear that my mom would also become mute, like my grandmother and aunt, was a constant worry. I will always be grateful that she was able to maintain her speech through the duration of her illness. Even though my mom could talk throughout, her communication pattern was affected. One clear example of this was repetitive speech. She would repeat what she heard on television. She would repeat words someone else had just spoken. Or when we would take a drive, she would read a road or business sign and repeat the words 5 to 10 times. She would also latch on to sayings and repeat it, whether it was relevant to the conversation or not. One of her favorites was okie dokie skokie nokie. Incontinence issues started about a year into my mom's disease. It started with what doctors diagnosed as an overactive bladder. The prescribed medication did nothing to alleviate the ever worsening symptoms of incontinence. My mom was utterly dejected. She struggled with embarrassment. She had a deep desire to work harder so these accidents wouldn't keep happening, even though we knew it was out of her control. She was worried about losing her dignity and more of her independence. She was concerned about being a burden to my dad and to me. On the other side of the coin, I, as the caregiver, faced my own challenges helping my mom with incontinence. I saw and felt her emotions. I tried to reassure her there was nothing to be embarrassed about. I tried to find ways to preserve her dignity. And I had to figure out the easiest, safest, quickest, and cleanest way to care for her bathroom needs. There is not readily available literature on these topics. It's trial by fire as the caregiver figures out the best ways to manage these changing toiletry needs. It's an overwhelming task. It's an unpleasant task, and it can be mortifying for both patient and caregiver. The final symptom that severely impacted my mom were seizures. Again, like her mother and her sister, these seizures were difficult to control with medications. My mom had her first seizure in February 2021. It came on quickly and unexpectedly. Her head turned to the left, her entire body went rigid, straight as a board, unmoving. Fear encompassed me and panic set in. As I was on the phone with 911, her condition continued to deteriorate. Her breathing was becoming labored. She was rigid, but had started shaking with tremors. Thankfully, the EMS stayed with me on the phone, calming me, advising me on steps to take, and assuring me that help was on the way. After multiple tests at the ER, it was determined to be a grand mal seizure. She was put on medication, and that medication did keep seizures at bay until February 2022. Almost exactly a year today of her first seizure, her seizures began again, and this time they did not respond well to the medication. My mom was averaging about one seizure episode a month from February 2022 until her death in August 2022. I say seizure episode because she would have clusters of seizures, each lasting 10 minutes or more. It was actually complications from a long, hard seizure that ended up taking her life. We don't know exactly how long that final seizure lasted, but the deep impact of the seizure on her body caused her to stop breathing. We were forced to make tough decisions rapidly and under distress. The intubation did not work. Her airway was damaged, and we knew that she would not recover from the trauma of the seizure and the life-saving measures that had been tried. She died 3 years after symptom onset.
I have now lost 5 family members to this disease. And between all of these loved ones, my family has witnessed and lived many examples within the top 5 most burdensome symptoms. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's sister, was the first to show symptoms, but we didn't recognize them as symptoms at first. Strange life events started happening. She and her husband divorced, she lost her job, she lost her car and her house. Her life was imploding for no apparent reason. Rumors flew among family and the community. Is she struggling with alcohol or drugs? Early on in the disease, she attended a family party. Her gait was shuffled, her speech was slurred, and guests at the party were whispering and wondering if she was drunk. Her behavior was erratic and surprising. She had stopped bathing. My uncle, her brother, went over to gently encourage her to take a shower. Without a moment's hesitation, she stripped down, stark naked, in her kitchen in front of her brother. Her cognition was also impacted. She was determined to keep driving for as long as possible. One day, while driving, she confused the gas pedal and the brake pedal. Rather than slowing down, she hit the gas and crashed into her apartment building. My mom, Phyllis, was the next family member to exhibit symptoms. She was aggressive and angry. Initially, we thought it was menopause or marital problems. When her gait changed, though, we knew it was something more. My mom enjoyed going for walks and could always keep up. One day we were walking at the Outer Banks and she wanted to visit some shops about a block away. She walked so slowly. We were going at a turtle's pace, and a walk that should have only taken a couple of minutes lasted for what felt like an eternity. My mom became aggressive and belligerent. Standard antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications did little to nothing to control her intense emotional disturbances. One particular incident stands out. My cousin Hannah was killed in a car accident at the age of 24. She had been talking on the phone with her boyfriend at the time of the accident. While we were at the viewing and standing in line, the boyfriend showed up, and my mom, who was generally quiet, began yelling, "You killed her, you killed her." This behavior was alarming and embarrassing. Looking back, it was the disease taking hold. My mom was the financial manager of my parents' home for the entirety of their marriage. As the disease took its toll, she was no longer able to effectively manage the finances. She had impulse control issues, and those issues became apparent through excessive buying. Even though my parents didn't have the money, Mom would spend extreme amounts on items they didn't need. It almost turned into a hoarder situation. Sadly, my mom also suffered from seizures. Her first one was a grand mal, and she had many that followed. During her seizures, she would lose control of her bowel and bladder. Urine and feces would be all over her and her room. Someone, usually my dad, would have to clean it all up. The seizures were traumatic for everyone. My uncle, Aunt Ruth and my mom's brother, was next to develop symptoms. He primarily suffered from cognitive problems. He was a lifelong mechanic. He worked at the same job for 32 years. But he could no longer find his way to work or find his way home. He forgot how to do his job, how to diagnose a mechanical problem, how to use the tools that his hands had held and manipulated for years. He forgot how to turn the shower on. He would wake in the middle of the night hungry, intending to cook something. He would turn the oven on and then forget about it, leaving the oven on, which almost led to a house fire.
I am Heidi's niece. The next person in our family to become ill was my mom, Heidi's oldest sister, Heather. I was the first to notice her symptoms. My mom started sending me weird texts that were garbled and didn't make any sense. She would get angry and lose her temper easily, and this was out of character for her. She was by nature a very nurturing and caring person. She would say odd, hurtful, almost hateful things. While my dad was on a hunting trip, she texted his sister saying she hoped he would never come back. Another time, our dog was barking and it was upsetting her, so she texted Aunt Heidi about how she was going to kill the dog. Similar to my grandmother Phyllis, my mom who had always been gentle and calm, suddenly became angry and irritated, losing her temper easily. Medication did nothing to curb her angry outbursts. One day, my family and I were cleaning the house, preparing for a party that evening. Each person had been assigned their own tasks. I was cleaning the tile. Out of the blue, my mom started screaming, "Maddie isn't doing anything. She needs to help clean." She was watching me clean the tile, but reality wasn't computing, and she was irate. She was the schedule keeper for our family. She was always super organized. She even had color-coded calendars to keep track of me and my brother's activities. As the disease progressed, she lost this ability. Our schedules got completely mixed up. She would show up on the wrong day for a doctor's appointment. Other times, the family would arrive on the wrong night for a sports game. Another scary time, she got confused when we went to the lake. We loved going to the lake as a family. She was helping my dad back the boat into the water, a task she had done hundreds of times. When she was supposed to pull the truck out, she got confused about the gears and pedals. The truck was backing up into the lake, and she didn't know how to pull it forward. I just knew that my mom, my little brother, and I were all going to end up trapped in the truck surrounded by lake water.
Shortly after Heather's symptom onset, my twin sister, Holly, also became symptomatic. Her mobility was severely impacted, especially her left side. It almost looked like she was limping, but in reality, her body was out of sync. When she got tired, her body would lean forward and to the left. One day, while we were walking, Holly, who had been, as normal, lagging behind, suddenly sped past me. When she was quite a ways ahead of me, I saw her grab onto a big boulder in an attempt to stop herself, but her legs wouldn't stop moving. Her legs were moving so rapidly, it looked like she was out of control on roller skates. She let go of the boulder and her legs continued to pull her forward towards an embankment. The terror in her eyes was acute. She looked over her shoulder and yelled, "I can't stop, I can't stop." In an attempt to stop herself, she fell onto her hands and knees. Holly also struggled with aggression. She and her only son, Mason, who was a teenager at the time, would get into an argument. Holly would chase him through the house, which scared him. He would lock himself in a room, and with Holly pounding on the door, he would frantically call me to come over and help, which I couldn't do because I lived an hour and a half away. Impulse control led to poor financial decisions. She would habitually attempt to buy items online, and when she couldn't figure out how to enter her credit card information, she would just use online chat options or business emails to contact retailers. In the chats or emails, she would release her credit card information with instructions to buy her the items she wanted. Communicating was also challenging. She struggled to find words. She would mix up words, changing or dropping letters. For example, chicken salad became sicken chalad, or when she was trying to ask to walk the dog, she would say og awk, and we had to determine what she was trying to say. Incontinence was another challenging symptom in Holly's fight with ALSP. Like Aaron's mother, Betty, one of the manifestations of incontinence was an overactive bladder. Holly's doctor chose to bypass medication and chose instead to treat her with a catheter. The use of this simple medical device made a big difference in Holly's quality of life. Before the use of the catheter, she was feeling the urge to go to the bathroom every 3 minutes. She was agitated and exhausted. I was fatigued from constant transferring of her to the bathroom. With the use of the catheter, Holly was able to relax, and so was I. Holly was calm, no longer agitated at the urge to go to the bathroom. I was no longer physically exhausted from transferring her multiple times each hour. The use of a catheter was a huge relief to Holly and to myself. Holly also endured seizures. Her seizures were focal, and she had recurring seizures until she passed. Her body would freeze and bend forward. She was aware enough of what was happening that she would try to stop her body from leaning. She would grab the back of her pants, holding and pulling in an attempt to straighten herself. Her final seizure before she was placed on hospice was very long. The medics couldn't get it to stop. Her leg and arm were stiff and continually tremoring. She was terrified and crying.
I am the eldest of 3 siblings, and we all carry the CSF1R mutation. Both my brothers are symptomatic. I am not. My baby brother Jeffrey was the first to exhibit symptoms. His very first symptom was speech-related. He woke up one morning and was unable to communicate. He called my mom, and he could only say, I, repeatedly. Nothing else. Still to this day, his speech is slurred, and it can be difficult to understand him. His motor symptoms were especially devastating. Jeffrey had been a soccer coach, overseeing college women's soccer and a youth organization for about 20 years. All of a sudden, this athletic, capable man was having dizzy spells, a shuffling gait, and legs that no longer responded to commands. He developed tremors, and his hands were strangely postured. I still vividly remember Christmas, sitting there watching him struggle to open his gifts. He couldn't even untie a bow. Another symptom that we were not prepared for was his inability to cry. If he is faced with anything sad, anything that would warrant crying, he laughs. It's uncontrollable and distressing to him. He tries to stop laughing, knowing it isn't appropriate, but he cannot. My brother is the most peaceful, gentle person, and yet, in the beginning of this disease, that was even taken from him. He had a very short temper. While he was in a nursing facility after his bone marrow transplant, he fought against apathy. He declared he did not want to go to any follow-up physician appointments. When I gently tried to help him understand why he needed to go, he became angry. His whole body trembled, and it trembled so violently that his bed began to shake. He started yelling, "Get out, get out!" My mom has shared that sometimes when he gets angry, he starts rocking so hard in his wheelchair, he will actually tip it over. Finally, Jeffrey, an intensely private and independent person, had to learn how to accept help going to the bathroom. I can only imagine how difficult this has been for him. When the incontinence first started, he was having accidents around the home. He would call my mom, who is 78, and she would go over and clean him and the mess up. My mom is his full-time caregiver. Jeffrey is very shy about this aspect of his illness and doesn't like to talk about it. He won't let anyone but our mom or a nurse change him. When I am there at their home helping out, and I know he needs to be changed, he's adamant that my mom is the only one who can help. This doesn't bother my mom, but it does bother me. It's a big deal because my 78-year-old mom is responsible for transitioning and cleaning an adult man, and I know that is physically hard on her. My middle brother, Joseph, exhibits severe behavioral symptoms. He has always struggled with a temper, so it was challenging to pinpoint the exact moment the disease began. But looking back, I realized that he was showing symptoms at my wedding in October of 2021. He and his wife had come into town to attend the wedding. I was expecting his help on the day of the wedding with things like unloading tables and chairs. My mom and aunt showed up to the venue with the tables and chairs. When I asked where Joseph was, he was shopping. When he finally showed up and I asked for help, he blew a fuse. He started screaming and yelling. I tried to stay calm and ask him for help, but that just incited more screaming, this time directed at his wife. I realized then that he didn't seem like himself, and looking back, I've wondered if it was a symptom of ALSP. Joseph's behavior became very apparent about 8 months later. He would get lost driving home from work. In fact, one day he mentioned to his wife that he needed to fill the car up with gas. 45 minutes later, and still no sign of him, his wife called. He had traveled nearly 25 miles away from his home, forgot to get gas, ended up running out of gas, and was stranded on the side of the road. He also began spending excessive amounts of money on random and strange items, racking up credit card debt. Paranoia also plagued him. If he was walking down the sidewalk and saw someone coming, he would hide behind a tree, whispering, "I know that guy. Don't let him know that I'm here." Other times he would call me, whispering frighteningly into the phone, "I need to talk to you about my wife, but I can't right now. She's spying on me." These symptoms are still occurring today.
We've given you multiple stories of the realities of symptoms for the patients. Some, if not all, may seem shocking. They are shocking, but they are not abnormal in the lives of ALSP patients. These are the stories we hear time and time again as we walk with families through this journey. From the patient perspective, you can see these symptoms are terrifying. They rob the person of independence, privacy, dignity, self-control, activities they love, and so much more. These symptoms can also cause financial damage, scandals of reputation, and wedges in relationships. From the caregiver perspective, these symptoms are overwhelming, surprising, and shocking. Generally, the loved one declines so rapidly, it is hard for the caregiver to adapt and adjust to the ever-emerging symptoms. An added layer and struggle with some caregivers is the notion that this eventually could be them. When you are caring for a parent or a sibling with a hereditary disease, there is the question, do I also carry this mutation and will I develop this disease? Many family members that are not tested assume they have the mutation and that they will also develop the disease. They honestly believe they will live and die in this nightmarish way. As they care for their loved one, they are simultaneously watching their own death play out in front of their eyes. They are vicariously living their loved one's death as if it were their own, believing it will be their own.
ALSP is a disease that doesn't just affect individuals, it affects families. The implications to family are deep and reaching. We've briefly touched on the financial burdens that incur on families. Again, because this disease hits in the prime of life, wealth has not been accrued. Families are at the beginning or in the middle of raising children. The cost of living is high. Patients are too young to qualify for government benefits available to the elderly. Two-income families suddenly find themselves trying to survive on one income, compounded by the unexpected cost of caring for a disabled adult. Aside from the financial challenges, ALSP brings with it major life disruptions, family conflict, and long-term breakdowns of the family unit.
ALSP brings with it huge, life-changing disruptions. During my mom's illness, I was intimately involved in her care. I was the care coordinator, appointment scheduler, mood lifter, shoulder to cry on, and family communicator, to list just a few of my jobs. Those were hard days. It was compounded by the fact that while my parents lived in Kansas, I live in Texas with my family. I was flying or driving back and forth at least every 2 months for a few weeks at a time. I would be away from my husband and young kids, and it was an adjustment for everyone. My kids had to grow up quickly, learn to take more responsibility around the home, adjust to the reality that their stay-at-home mom wasn't at home all the time anymore. And my husband was left to manage the household, continue to work full-time, and care for all the needs of our kids, almost like a single parent without support.
I had worked as an HR director for over 20 years, but when my mom became ill, I made the decision to quit my job to help care for her. Thankfully, when my sisters became ill, I was working from home, so I was better able to manage my schedule to help their care. But even during that time, life wasn't without disruptions. My older sister underwent a bone marrow transplant in Minnesota. I was her donor, so I was traveling back and forth between Pennsylvania and Minnesota regularly, leaving my child and my husband, who has early onset dementia, at home.
I was only 14 when my mom, Heather, became ill. From the outside, it may not have looked like my life was interrupted, but it definitely was. I still went to school every day, but I would put on a shield. I didn't tell anyone what was going on at home. How do you tell other kids what is happening? No one can understand. I just put a smile on my face, went to school, went through the motions, and came home to a mom who was very ill. It was hard on me. It was hard on my little brother. It was hard on my dad. After my parents made the decision that my mom would undergo the bone marrow transplant, they were gone for extended periods of time, traveling to Minnesota and then living in the hospital after the transplant. My little brother and I didn't accompany them. We stayed behind, continued going to school, and participating in various activities. But it was really difficult. We were used to having our parents, especially our mother, around and involved. Aunt Heidi stepped up and helped take care of us, but it was a big change in our routine and life.
My life has changed in dramatic ways since my youngest brother Jeffrey became sick. While my mom is his primary caregiver, I have taken on a heavy role in his care. I am his researcher and advocate. I have taken point in getting him connected to the right doctors, and I work tirelessly to get him approved for a bone marrow transplant. While his disease progression has stopped, he is now considered chronically ill and disabled. He still requires full-time care and everything that comes with that. I have worked in the banking industry for over 30 years. I finally made the decision to quit my job and pursue work that will allow me more time with my family and more flexibility to help care for Jeffrey. In this disease, every person in the family is affected, and each individual has to make certain sacrifices.
These life changes and sacrifices tend to lead to intense family conflict. My dad, who was the primary caregiver for my mom, was coping poorly with my mom's illness and decline. He was drinking excessively. Data shows that nearly 10% of family caregivers struggle with substance addiction. He was having angry outbursts that were directed at my mom. He would leave her alone for extended periods of time when she was past the point of being able to care for herself. She would call, needing help, and I was left to manage the potential emergency situation over the phone 800 miles away. It was very stressful, and we struggled through multiple disagreements over proper care and compassion toward my mother.
My mom takes excellent care of Jeffrey. She is loving and compassionate. They both find moments of joy and laughter to share, but we have, and still do, experience disagreements on the best situation for Jeffrey, my mom, and myself. We've had to struggle a bit when deciding where Jeffrey should live after undergoing his bone marrow transplant. I can see that the burdens of caregiving can take a toll on my mom. She has had to have 2 back surgeries. It is unsafe for her to lift and move Jeffrey. On the other side, we've had a very hard time finding an appropriate long-term care facility for Jeffrey. Many won't take him because of his age. The facility he was in wasn't allowing for therapies, particularly physical therapy that he needs. We have been able to come to solutions that everyone can live with, but it adds layers of stress to an already stressful situation.
My sisters, Heather and Holly, and I essentially took over the care for our mother. We were doing all the things from paying bills, scheduling and taking her to doctors, appointments, bathing her and dressing her. Simultaneously, we were managing our own households, raising our children, and attempting to hold down employment. My dad checked out. When my mom reached the point that she could have gone to a care facility, my dad came back with a vengeance, fighting us about the decision. He was very suspicious of us, accusing us of trying to take his money. We didn't care about money. We just wanted our mom to have good care. It's agonizing to see and live the breakdown of family over money and care decisions. Similarly, when I was caring for my twin Holly, I had to make the decision to sell her home to have money to provide her care. She was furious. So much guilt comes along with these types of decisions. As a caregiver, it is easy to second guess yourself, wondering if you are making the right decision and what that decision will cost in terms of relationships.
Our family life changed dramatically with the onset of my mom's illness, but our family life was devastated by my mom's passing. My family fractured beyond recognition. Sadly, it was not the first dramatic fracture I had endured. After my grandmother passed away, my grandfather just left everyone in the family in the dust. It was like he wanted a new life. When she passed, my aunts and I were expecting him to step up, to want to see us and his family, to keep the family together, but he didn't. Following the same course, my dad moved on quickly after my mom died. At a time when my brother and I needed to grieve our mom and his wife together, to find our way forward as a family, he found a new family and a new life. Less than a year after my mom died, he had a girlfriend. It feels like she is replacing my mom and leaving very little room for me and my brother in their new life together. No matter how many times my dad assures me that isn't the case, it still feels that way. I think, how can I not get over my mom's passing, and how can he get over it so soon? I want my dad to be happy, but it's just an adjustment. I feel lonely and my dad is all I have. During my mom's illness, my dad and I got really close, but once he got a girlfriend, it felt and still feels like I was put to the side. It's hard and I don't know how to get over it. Maybe I don't. ALSP devastates families. It has devastated my family multiple times over. It changes the family dynamics, it changes the family relationships, and it changes the stability of families.
My grandfather and dad followed in a similar pattern. Our once tight-knit family, a family who went to church together, vacationed together, and did life together, was broken. My grandfather began dating while my grandmother was living in a nursing home, and he was remarried 6 months after my grandmother died. This caused much strain on our entire family, and the once strong relationships were marred by anger and resentment. Family dynamics changed dramatically and were never fully repaired. And the pattern continued with my dad. 2 weeks after my mom passed away, somewhat unexpectedly from a seizure, my dad unexpectedly had a girlfriend. 4 months after my mom passed away, my dad had sold all our family possessions, memories, and our family home and had moved in with a stranger. As Maddie put so well, he wanted a new life. My brother, myself, our spouses, and our children were reeling from the death of my mom. And before we had time to process the reality of her death, we lost my dad too. But we didn't lose him to death. We lost him to desertion.
As Maddie alluded to, my father responded to my mom's death by leaving the old life behind and creating a new one. We hear this story over and over in our community. Families are left fractured and broken. The family breakdown is real. But the need for these care partners to stay present with their families after the passing of a loved one is vitally important for the well-being of the entire family. We need to do a better job of helping care partners stay present for their own sake and for the sake of the entire family. This is true in any instance of a death in the family. It is particularly true and necessary in families where an autosomal dominant disease is present, such as ALSP. The reality is that another member of the family will get ill, and a strong family unit is imperative when faced with this reality.
The inheritance pattern of ALSP weighs heavily on individuals and families affected by ALSP. Let me repeat, ALSP doesn't just affect individuals. ALSP affects the entire family. Take my family as a prime example. 3 out of 3 kids carry the genetic mutation that causes ALSP. 2 of the 3 are symptomatic. Our mom is elderly. I am in line to care for my brother Jeffrey. Who will care for him if I become ill? We must maintain a strong and steady family unit so that we can cope and support each other through the changes of life that come with ALSP.
On the day we received my mom's genetic test results, mutation on the CSF1R gene, mutation likely pathogenic, I knew that I and multiple members of my family had a difficult decision in our future, to test or not to test. That was the question. I did eventually get tested and I am negative. I do not carry the mutation on the CSF1R gene, the mutation that took the life of my grandmother, my aunts, and my mom. Hearing that news was a relief. But the truth is, I still carry a heavy weight knowing that statistically, my family's not seen the last of this horrific disease. I have 2 aunts, a brother, and 3 cousins who are still at risk. And depending upon who of those 6 is a carrier, there are other cousins, nieces, and nephews who are at risk. I've already seen the lasting damage this disease does to individuals in our family, and knowing that we will live through this again is a sickening reality.
I got tested at the age of 18. I do not carry the CSF1R mutation, but my cousin is positive. My second cousin is positive and ill, and my little brother, who is 16, has not yet been tested. I am so scared that he carries this mutation and that I will have to watch him suffer and die from ALSP. This is the biggest reason I am involved in Sisters Hope Foundation. We are working hard to find viable treatments and, hopefully, a cure for this deadly disease.
We have shared stories highlighting the challenges of symptom management using already available FDA-approved medications. Most of the readily available medications do little to curb the devastating symptoms of this disease. We have seen simple medical devices such as catheters and feeding tubes improve quality of life when used. However, these devices are not readily prescribed for use in the United States. Despite these challenges, progress towards viable treatments has been made in the last 3 years within the ALSP space. Some of our patients have been offered the option of an experimental bone marrow transplant. Researchers are interested and invested in ALSP, and pharmaceutical companies are hoping to use research to create treatments. There's currently a drug trial in process. The use of these experiments and this research has created even more complexities and challenges to our patient and family community. Some patients, like my mother, are too far advanced in disease progression by the time they are diagnosed to participate in trials. Either traveling is beyond what they are capable of, or they are disqualified from research studies because their symptom burdens are too great. We now have 3 separate groups that need treatments within our community. We have asymptomatic carriers. These people have the gene mutation that will likely cause ALSP. They are in need of preventative treatments. We have chronic patients. These are the people who have undergone and survived the bone marrow transplant. Their disease progression has stopped, but they are left with varying degrees of disability. Most are unable to work, and many require full-time care. They're chronically ill. They need medications that can effectively manage their symptoms, and they are hopeful for treatments that will repair the damage in their brain and restore their ability to fully function in daily life. Finally, we have terminally ill patients. These are the people who are so far advanced in their symptoms that they do not qualify for potential treatments, or the treatments are not working to stop the progression of the disease.
Through experiments and research, we have learned much, and those lessons have come at a cost. My older sister, Heather, was given the option to undergo the bone marrow transplant. She was only the 3rd person at the University of Minnesota to receive this option. Because of her experience, my twin, Holly, chose to forgo the bone marrow transplant and live out the rest of her days with her family at home.
The same day my mom got diagnosed with ALSP, her neurologist told us about the experimental bone marrow transplant. I was only 15 years old at the time, and I didn't fully grasp the complexities of the situation, like the genetic component and the invasiveness of the bone marrow transplant. I was obviously really scared. While there was hope, there was actually something to do. It was still so scary. My parents made the decision that my mom would undergo the bone marrow transplant, but this decision brought more challenges. The procedure took place in Minnesota. My dad and Aunt Heidi flew with my mom out to Minnesota. My brother and I stayed in Pennsylvania to continue with school. We didn't know that when we kissed and hugged her before sending her to Minnesota, that would be the last time she was home.
I was Heather's donor, a 100% match. Her transplant took place during the COVID pandemic, and we were not allowed to accompany her into the hospital. I vividly remember watching Heather walk into the hospital carrying her suitcase. She walked herself into the hospital. She never walked out.
My mom did not make it through the process. After receiving the bone marrow, she had a massive heart attack and never recovered. My brother, Aunt Heidi, Aunt Holly, and I flew up to Minnesota. The hospital made an exception to let us in to see her so we could say our goodbyes, and then we flew home. I will always remember the day we got the call from my dad saying she had passed. I was sitting at a restaurant eating lunch with my aunt, uncle, and brother when my dad called to tell me she had died. This was a pivotal moment in my life. I knew my life would never be the same again.
Our grief was compounded. We had lost Heather 1 year into her symptom onset, and we all knew that Holly was declining quickly. Holly, after watching Heather go through the bone marrow transplant, chose not to pursue the same fate. This was a brave and frightening decision. By turning this option down, she knew ALSP would take her life. There were no other treatment options. 10 months after Heather passed, Holly lost her battle with ALSP. Less than 2 years after symptom onset.
My family is in an interesting position and can offer a well-rounded perspective on the current state of experimental and clinical trial treatments. After we finally received a correct diagnosis for my youngest brother, Jeffrey, thank you, Dr. Gelfand, we did a lot of research and self-advocating and determined that he was eligible for a bone marrow transplant. After some intense fighting with the insurance company, Jeffrey started the bone marrow transplant on March 17th, 2022. It was an intense and invasive process. Thankfully, Jeffrey tolerated the chemo well. About 5 days into the process, he lost the ability to speak. The symptom did resolve in about 48 hours, and he was once again able to communicate, although his speech was still slurred. After that incident, it was pretty much smooth sailing with the process. It could not have gone better. It was after this process that the real challenges began. We could not find a rehab or long-term care facility that would accept Jeffrey. We needed to keep him close to the hospital that did his bone marrow transplant so they could conduct his follow-up appointments. My mom and I lived 5 hours from the hospital, and we knew that moving him home couldn't be an alternative. At one point, my mom considered selling her home, where she's lived for over 30 years, so that she could move close to the hospital. But I pushed the hospital to keep searching for a facility that would accept Jeffrey. He was still excessively weak. He needed a high level of care. He needed therapy. Still, the hospital was ready to kick him out. They were calling every day telling us to come and pick him up. Finally, after forcing the hospital to keep searching, they found a facility that would accept him, accept his young age, and accept learning about a new disease and how to care for someone with that disease. The transition into a long care facility was hard on Jeffrey. And once again, we were faced with a roadblock to his care. Physical therapy was necessary for his rehab after the transplant. Insurance stopped paying shortly after he entered the facility, and for the next 9 months, we fought insurance and attempted to use other routes to get him the therapy he required. Ultimately, we had to make the very tough decision to move him home to live with my mom, acting as his primary caregiver. They are making it work, but as I mentioned earlier, it is not without its bad days and difficulties. My mom and Jeffrey were living under the assumption that after the bone marrow transplant, he would regain many of the pieces of life that the disease had taken, like walking, talking clearly, and living independently. The transplant did stop the progression of the disease, but it has not and is not expected to repair the damage to the brain that ALSP has already inflicted. It is a tough reality to accept. This is his life for the foreseeable future, and some days that's just too much to bear. My middle brother, Joseph, is a participant in the current clinical trial. He and his wife, Christy, travel from Texas to Florida every month for doctor's appointments, tests, and the infusion. Travel is taxing on them. Christy is responsible for all the packing, all the arrangements, and navigating all the appointments while they are in Florida. At the same time, she is managing my brother who struggles with anxiety, paranoia, defiance, and other behavioral issues. She has to manage all aspects of their lives and his mood. Finally, we are aware that this situation, while less invasive than the bone marrow transplant, will potentially have the same end result. It may stop progression, but it will not reverse the damage and correct manifested symptoms. The questions and doubts are always lurking. Will Joseph end up in the same or similar situation as Jeffrey? How will we manage 2 disabled adults that need full-time care? But at the end of the day, we want to be part of research. We want to make a difference for future generations, and we hope that perhaps a cure may be found that will benefit all 3 of us. Joseph participating in the clinical trial, me, the asymptomatic carrier, and Jeffrey, the chronically ill.
Our community desperately wants viable treatments and a cure. We know that your role at the FDA is an important piece of making this a reality. So when considering the disease course, the disease impact, and the long-term implications of this disease, our community is quite unified in what we expect from clinical trials and treatments. We would like to share some specific quotes from our community on their thoughts about risk versus benefit when contemplating participation in clinical trials or experimental treatments. This is what members of our community had to say. My loved one can no longer get treatment. She is too far advanced. At one point, she was willing to do anything. Another wrote, my loved one risked her life to have a transplant. And another, with limited treatment available, risk is almost not a consideration to try to prevent death. Another wrote, our family would try anything if it might help. Still another, it is my understanding that the most dangerous treatment option is the bone marrow transplant. I believe most people who have been diagnosed with this gene mutation, who have lost family members to ALSP, would consider this treatment in the face of this terrible and fatal disease. Another wrote, the prognosis of this condition is dismal. The question after diagnosis and initial symptoms is how quickly things progress. The biggest risk, in my opinion, is that the disease progresses to a severe state and then halts, leading to a very poor quality of life. The likelihood of any treatment being worse than the natural progression of this disease with its inherent variability is low, with the potential benefits being much higher. And finally, as a carrier of the mutated CSF1R gene, I would be willing to accept any risk of any available treatments for a potential cure or way to treat this disease, as I am currently asymptomatic and want to fight to cure this disease with all my might, not only for myself, but others in the same situation as me.
As you can hear, our community is passionate and dedicated to finding a viable treatment and cure for this disease. Our patients are willing to take on enormous risk for themselves to find a viable treatment. To be clear, when our community says viable treatment, they are speaking of a treatment that is highly effective in slowing the progression of the disease and improving the quality of life of the patient. As a rare disease, clinical trials come with their own challenges based on the inherently low number of people able to participate in any given trial. To combat this problem, we believe that in clinical trial design, it is important to consider the following things. First, it is important to make participation as easy as possible for the patients. This includes things such as considering convenience for patients. If possible, limit the amount of travel they must do. Make sure they are fairly compensated for their participation in the trial. Secondly, consider eligibility requirements carefully, making sure to include as many patients as possible. We believe it is important to offer the treatments to all participants. Natural history studies can hopefully offer a control group rather than giving some participants of the trial a placebo. It is imperative to allow studies to continue even with a small sample size. While our community may look small, we are mighty. Our disease affects multiple generations, and we believe this disease is highly underdiagnosed. Thirdly, when writing clinical study protocol, we recognize that it is important to have clear, concise requirements and measurements. That being said, we are requesting that those protocols not be so stringent that they overshadow the human aspect and experience. Finally, considering the rapid progression of ALSP, we need a rapid response. We ask the FDA to consider accelerated approval for all potential treatments that produce data showing positive impact on slowing disease progression and increasing quality of life for our patients. Our community is open to all methods of treatment, whether be a pill, an infusion, gene therapy, or any other idea that researchers may bring forward. We embrace innovation and creativity, and we will support anyone willing to work within this space and on the behalf of our patients and families. Sisters Hope is continuing to work to make a positive impact supporting our patients and families living with ALSP. We are working to bring awareness and education to the wider community of clinicians and researchers, and we are always working to instill hope for all living with and fighting this disease. This is the most important thing of all. Our community has hope. It is hope that keeps each of us going. It is hope that pushes the researchers forward in their work. It is hope that propels you at the FDA as you work to make a difference in the lives of families impacted by disease. It is hope that keeps us all motivated and fit for fighting. We hope for more understanding. We hope for better care. We hope for more support. We hope for viable treatments. We hope for a cure. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that was a lot, wasn't it? Yeah, but it was great. And it was a privilege to be able to speak to the FDA and share all of our experiences. And I can tell you, just based on their responses, they had a lot of questions. They were impressed with what we had to say, and it was really, really good. And I was honored to be part of that.